when they're spoken about in here. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult. So the vocab is really important. When it is referring to things like the conjugate axis or the transverse axis, we have to know what those are. So the transverse axis is the axis that the vertices of the hyperbola are on, and the conjugate axis is the other one. So the conjugate axis is referring to B, and the transverse axis is referring to A. Okay, in case, like, if to put like a letter to it. You have to know which way the hyperbola is opening to know what letter to start with. So it's either going to start with like x minus h or y minus k. So I usually draw something just to give me a general idea about what this is going to look like. So these 2 points are endpoints of the conjugate axis. If the endpoints of the conjugate axis are in the vertical direction, then that means that the rest of the hyperbola is going to open left or right, because the hyperbola itself is on what we call the transverse axis. So if the conjugate axis is vertical, then the transverse axis is horizontal, which means we're starting with x. So your general equation should look like this. Don't forget the equals 1, because that's like the main mistake people make. So they'll get all of this right, then they forget the equals 1, and that's the part that makes it an equation. So you don't want to forget the equation part of it. That's important. You can find the center, HK, by finding the center of these 2 points. So you can do that either graphically or algebraically. If you want to just look at the graph and maybe just like find the middle by counting, you can do that. Otherwise, you would find the midpoint of these 2 points. So to find the midpoint, you would add up the x's and divide by 2, and then add up the y's and divide by 2. So this is negative 4 over 2, which is negative 2. This is 8 over 2, which is positive 4. So that's my center. So the center is the midpoint of lots of stuff. Like if they give you endpoints, the center's the midpoint. If they give you foci, the center's the midpoint. Center's pretty much the midpoint of any points they could probably give you. So we're going to fill that in. So that's going to be x plus 2 squared and y minus 4 squared. Okay, A can be found using this piece of information. It says the transverse axis has a length of 10. That's the whole axis. So from one vertex to another vertex, that whole length is 10, which means A would be half of that. So when they give you the transverse axis, you're going to chop it in half to find A. So what would we put here? What goes down here?
Number
25. So you square it, and you get 25.
Yeah.
So you take half of it, and then you square it. Not square it.
We take half of what?
Half of the transverse axis,
okay,
that's 10.
right,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now the conjugate axis, they didn't give you how long it was, but you could figure it out. Or you could count once you find the center. So what's the distance between 2, 6 and, or negative 2, 6 and negative 2, 2?
4.
4. So if the whole thing is 4, that makes B 2. The whole thing. So from here to here is 4. So that makes B 2. So we would put 2 squared here. And that's it. That's your answer. Questions? All right, so example 2, we got foci at negative 2, 6. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Focus right there. And then we got another one at negative 2, negative 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So if the foci are here, then that means the hyperbola is opening up vertically, because the foci are in the direction of the opening. Now, it also gives us vertices. So vertices are at -2, 5 right before this, and then -2, -3 right before this. So those are the points that make the hyperbola. So since it's opening vertically, we want to write y first. Now, again, we can find our center by finding the midpoint of either of these. Like, you could find the midpoint of the foci, or you can find the midpoint of the vertices, whichever you prefer. So let's just use the foci. Those are even. Maybe they're easier. So if these are my foci, I'm going to find the midpoint by doing -2 plus -2 divided by 2, and then 6 plus -4 divided by 2. So this is -4 over 2, which is -2. This is 2 over 2, which is 1. So that's the center. Okay. When you put the center in the equation, make sure you put the 1 as k. So the 1 goes with y, and then the 2 goes with x. So we're going to have x plus 2 because it's a -2. And then we'll fill in a and b. Now A, so once you find your center, so center is right here. Once you find your center, you can find A by finding the distance between the center and the vertex. So this is one of the vertices, and my center is at -2, 1. What is the distance between these 2 points?
4.
Right, so that makes A 4.
Would it be 4 or -4?
It's a distance.
Oh, okay.
So you would do like 5 minus 1, that would be
okay.
4.
Alright.
Either way, I guess even if you got -4, you have to square it to put it in the equation, so it doesn't matter.
16.
Yeah, so 16 is going to go underneath y because we just counted that vertical distance, right? Now, they don't give us anything about the conjugate axis, which means we have nothing for b, but they do give us the foci. Okay, so we're going to use the foci to find b. The distance from my center to the focus, that distance is c. So what is that distance? How far is center from foci? Right, 5. And again, you could see that on a graph. So this distance is 5. So you could count that on a graph if you prefer the visual way. Right, so like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that makes c 5. So then you're going to do a squared plus b squared equals c squared to figure out what b squared is. So if a squared is 16, we don't know b squared. C squared is 25. Okay, 16 plus what is 25? That's b squared.
7. Just kidding. It's
9. There you go. Put that in.
But I don't get this. You had to have used that one, right? Because if you used the other one, then you wouldn't know that 5.
No, you still get 5.
1 and -4?
Yeah, 1 minus -4 is 5.
Yeah.
What is 3?
No, 1 minus 4 is 3, but 1 minus -4 is 5. 1 plus -4 is 3. The distance would be subtraction. Yeah.
So if you put 1 minus negative.
Okay, and then you would just need to find their denominators. So that's a squared and b squared. Now, they tell you the conjugate axis
Should be Y.
is 16. So that's b. So if the whole thing is 16, b would be 8, or 64 would go here. We don't know anything about a, so we have to use the a squared plus b squared equals c squared. They do tell us where the foci are. Okay, if this foci or focus point is at 6, 0 and the center's at 0, 0, that makes c 6. So you're going to do a squared plus b squared equals c squared to find a squared.
Does it not work if you plugged in H for 64 and 6 for 36? I just like for like numbers wise.
I think there's a typo here. Because this doesn't make sense now. Yeah, something's up with this. Because when we subtract 64, we get something negative, and it's not supposed to be.
Yeah,
So maybe I meant this to be 8 or something. So let's change this guy to 8 so that this works out. So if that's 8,
Yeah, and you expect us to do that.
I know, I'm sorry. If the conjugate axis is 8, then that would make B 4.
Yeah.
So if B is 4, we would have B squared as 16.
Pulling out the white out.
Yeah, my bad, sorry. Let's change that to a 16, and then we can just subtract 16. We won't get a negative number now. So that means A squared is 20. And then we just go, put that in there, 20. My bad. I don't know. Maybe it was supposed to be 6. I have no idea what it was supposed to be, but it's wrong. Because you shouldn't get a negative something squared. It doesn't make sense for lots of reasons.